tour in Vietnam as a 9th Infantry Division battalion commander. In the book, he explains the hit-and-run tactics he employed from his 1966 handbook, Vietnam Primer, to transform the troops into a mobile counter-guerrilla force. This program is an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this very special event featuring our honored guest, Colonel David Hackworth. As you know, his latest book is Steal My Soldiers' Hearts. He is here to discuss the book, and after the discussion, we will have a signing. He can sign your books and answer questions. I have distributed cards. If you have a question for Colonel Hackworth, please write it on the card. We will collect the cards and he will answer your questions. So here's the person you really want to meet, Colonel David Hackworth. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. And welcome on this very, very cool El Paso day. My pleasure being here, and you are witnessing America's most reluctant author, full stop. Did not want to write this book for many reasons. I had taken Vietnam, as many of you have, and locked it up behind a whole bunch of doors in my head. Never wanted to go there again. But my wife, and wives can be reasonably persuasive, felt that we should tell the story, and her motivation was, and she's the co-writer of the book, was, and that's Elise England. She won't be a Hackworth, I don't know why. And she had gone to our annual reunion, and the battalion has met every year for the past 12 years in different spots. And what she saw was not what I saw. What I saw was 19-year-old boys who are now 55, but to me there will always be 19, 20-year-old boys. And she saw an incredible pain. She saw these heroes not having closure with their Vietnam experience. And she felt it be imperative that we tell their story. Not just the story of the 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry, but the story of all of those who served in Vietnam. That was 2.5 million folks that served on the ground, in the air, and at sea. And all of those who served in the armed forces during that time. Germany, Alaska, the Panama, stopping the Soviet Union from coming our way. That makes 17.5 million folks. Then there were about 50 million more folks who were like my wife, who did everything they could to get us out of Vietnam, running around putting flowers in rifles and waving placards and demonstrating and so on. Now, all 70 million of us, for one reason or the other, carry guilt. Those who went carry guilt. Those who didn't go feel really terribly that they didn't get a leg blown off or get shot at or some dumb thing. And those that protested now look at their demonstration and they feel guilty. So there's 70 million of us that haven't recovered from the Vietnam experience. So it was her thought, and once she took the shotgun away from my head, it became my thought that if we tell their story, it might bring closure on the Vietnam exercise, because those men and women who fought in Vietnam were noble heroes. The war was not a noble war, but they were noble people. And somewhere along the line, our citizens got confused, and when they came marching home, they didn't get the reception that their fathers got when they marched home from the big war after slaying the Nazis and the Japanese. No parades, no thank yous, no welcome homes. They got, you're a baby killer. They got, you are a Nazi, you are a murderer, you are frequently veterans from Vietnam were spit upon. And so they internalized this pain, and many of them, kind of like me, locked their experience behind a whole bunch of doors. And many of the sons of Vietnam veterans have told me they have never heard their fathers tell them of experience of Vietnam. The fathers never went there. So it's my hope that we will, at long last, understand what Vietnam was about and the great heroism of the Vietnam veterans. And you have to understand, the setting of this battalion was 1968-69. If you understand the war, we got into it in 65 with the first U.S. units, all regular units. And then we morphed into a draftee army. By 1969, most of your infantry battalions were 95% draftee. And the leadership wasn't like it was on the earlier tours. Now, these draftees were 14, 15 years old in 1965. So they watched the blood pour out of the tube every night. 65, 66, 67, 68. They watched their brothers come home, shy a leg, shy an arm. Maybe they watched their brothers not come home, or the kid next door not come home. So they well understood by the time Uncle Sam said, we want you, get on the bus, off to the induction center, basic training, that the war was not winnable. Yet they did exactly as their fathers did 20 years before. They marched off to the war. And we didn't treat them too well when they came back. So I had the great privilege of commanding a battalion of these soldiers, and so that's their story. And how I put the story together with my wife was, first of all, I had my memories, and then I had a fair amount of recordings from that war, journal notes, notebooks, and all the things that soldiers and commanders and all kind of tuck away, plus a lot of letters home. Then I went to the National Archives and went through their records, got the battalion log, which gave minute for minute what happened during the time of this battalion. And from that, I was able to contact about 300 soldiers from the battalion. They were soldiers in the battalion who supported the battalion, the Red Legs, for example, the chopper pilot, the fighter pilot, the kid that drove up the truck with bringing the beans and bullets. We got all their stories and put them together. And my wife said, well, now what you'll do is just interview all these guys. I said, Roger, that'll be easy. And I say, how you doing, Greg? It's Hack. Oh, Colonel, sir, how are you? Forget that stuff. That was 33 years ago. Please call me Hack. Sure, Hack, sir. No, forget the Hack, sir stuff. Just what I want to know is what happened on 23 March. Yes, sir, 23 March. The guys all froze up. Couldn't tell me diddly squat. So my wife said, get out of there. I'm taking over the interviews. And she did. And I had to give her quick basic training. This is a rifle, this is a squad, this is a PFC, this is a general. But she was a quick study, and she got it together. And then she started interviewing Greg, and Greg would tell her all of these incredible stories. All the doors opened, and he just poured it out. And through that telling became the incredible gold that's in this story. And that's the story of the squad leader, the platoon leader, the machine gunner, the cannoneer, the pilot. It's all of their yarns kind of wove through this rich tapestry that makes this final rug, which tells the story of this battalion. How it all came about was in December of 1968, just shy of Christmas, at 3 in the morning, the phone rang. And it was a colonel in the Pentagon. Now, in the Pentagon, 6 o'clock in the morning to them is 6 o'clock in the morning all the way around the world. They don't care. But it was 3 o'clock in the morning where I was, so I groggily said, hey, it's Hackworth here. They said, we have a request by name for you to take over the sorriest, the worst. They call it the Hopeless Battalion, out in the 9th Division in Vietnam, and you've been asked for by a general, and when generals ask for things, everybody jumps, and so we have to pass it on to you. Our suggestion to you is say no. You commanded a battalion in the 101st Airborne in Vietnam early in the war. You've done it. You're now commanding a battalion. And I was commanding a battalion at Fort Lewis, training soldiers for Vietnam. And just that day before, I was sitting up on the top of Mount Rainier. Anybody here been to Mount Rainier? All right. Sitting up on the top of Mount Rainier in 3 feet of snow, training my soldiers for Vietnam. You get the picture? And so the guy said, we suggest you say no, and you go off to War College and to bigger and better things and all of that. And I said, I thought about it for probably the sum total of, maybe 3 seconds. And I said, I'm out of here. I'll be on the next plane. I got my toothbrush. And didn't make my wife too happy. And off I trotted to Vietnam and got a good look at this battalion. And I'd seen a lot of battalions in the previous 23 years that I'd been a soldier. And in those 23 years, I'd spent 5 years at platoon level, and then I'd commanded 10 companies, artillery, infantry, armor, armored cav, raider, every kind of different outfit you could imagine. So, and now my 3rd battalion, so I had a fair idea, as an old carpenter might have, what was in my toolbox and how to build a good house. And but I looked at this battalion, oh man, this house is so demolished, it'll never come together. It was the greatest challenge that I think that a soldier had in a long, long time. It was on its butt, full stop. And one of my first experiences, besides seeing machine guns red with rust and rifles red with rust, and ammunition laying in the mud, and soldiers running around. Anybody in Vietnam in '69? Because I think this was kind of standard issue in Vietnam at that time. It wasn't just this battalion, but I thought it was just this battalion. And soldiers running around with peace symbols and doing peace stuff and bopping around. There was a funny smell in the air that you couldn't buy at the corner drugstore. And one of my first encounters with one of the soldiers were their peace symbols and graffiti all over their helmet's liner. There's a little cloth liner that you use to break up the silhouette of the helmet, which was green, because Vietnam was not white and snow and all that stuff. It really was green jungle foliage. And things like, suppose they had a war and nobody came, and all kinds of stuff like that. And one little emblem that somewhat attracted me was this thing that said FTA. And I mean, this FTA was that big across the front of his helmet. I thought, got a kindred soul, man. Somebody that joined the Army the reason I joined the Army, which was fun, travel, adventure. So I bopped up to this young sergeant and said, hey, FTA. What does that mean? He looked down and he started pawing the ground with his boots. And I said, well, tell me what that means, son. He said, well, sure, it means, I can't say it on public television, but it's something like fuzz the Army. And boy, it brought out my Irish straight away. So from then on, it was a challenge of finding out what was wrong with this unit and making it work. Now, I had been trained in Italy by World War II sergeants who had fought from Africa through Sicily and up to that rugged spine of Italy, which was the hardest fighting for American forces in a sustained manner in World War II. It was tough. And these guys were pros. And they saw this little 15-year-old kid report into their unit with a little pink face and all that stuff. And they'd seen a lot of little kids get planted in Africa, in Sicily, and on that long trip up through Italy. So they just picked up a 2x4 and swatted me in the back of the head, because they came from the school, you get it right in training or you die on the battlefield. So that was how I was trained for 4 hard years. That was the standard that caused me to understand what soldiering was all about. And that NCOs were the steel spine of the unit. They never saw an officer in Italy. The officers were always doing pay call, inventorying the PX, and riding around on horses and cars and stuff. And the NCOs ran everything. And there was no micromanagement. It was, you looked at your platoon or company and decided what training you were going to have as a sergeant, and you just wrote your own training schedule and never submitted it to anybody, and you did it. And so what I then had to do was take a look at this battalion and determine how I was going to fix it. And it was in really bad shape. And I realized that from my experience that there are no bad units, none whatsoever. There are no bad soldiers, none whatsoever. There are only bad leaders. So the problem with this battalion was there were bad leaders. So I had to figure out who was bad and who was good. Now, on day one, I looked over the battalion and saw it was so raggedy, and the colonel that I replaced, he got a Silver Star, a Legion of Merit, and patted on the head for doing a great job. The battalion had not encountered the enemy in a successful manner in the previous 6 months, but it stacked up 600 wounded and dead. So if the battalion commander couldn't square the battalion away, then who should have squared it away? The sergeant major. So first thing I did was, Sergeant Major, get on the bird, you're out of here. Why me, sir? I says, if you allowed this unit to be in this shape, you shouldn't be a Sergeant Major and you shouldn't be a leader of men. On the chopper, out of here. So that was basically my approach for the next 2 months, as I never smiled, and I was just this old grouchy guy, and I went out with every company, and I check out the company commander, realize good man, bad man, make a bunch of marks in my head. Then I'd go down to one of his platoon, spend about 4 or 5 hours with that platoon on the same day. Then I'd go down to one of his squads, spend 4 or 5, 6 hours with that squad, and then at the end of the day, I had a whole battalion to fight. I'd jump in a chopper and come home. But I had a fairly good idea of A company, B company, C company, D company, and I kept a little notebook on what was going on. And I saw the good men and the bad men, who should be out of there and who should stay and take over. And it was through that 3-week experience that I was able to run this unit throughout a place called the Plain of Reeds, a very beautiful vacation spot. You must go there, along the Cambodian border. That I realized that I realized by the end of that who was strong, who was bad. So then I, quick, smart, fired 59 lieutenants, 8 captains, and 3 majors. Boom, 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 boom. And the lieutenant would say, where should I go? I don't care. Walk down the road. See if you can hitchhike a ride in a helicopter. You're not staying here because you're not going to kill my soldiers. Now, the soldiers weren't so dumb, and they said, well, maybe this guy's for real. You know, maybe we got somebody different. He's getting rid of all, they know who, soldiers are the first ones who know who are bad, and he's getting rid of all the bad guys. And at the same time, as I saw a good guy come in, then, or identified a good guy, you've got this job, you've got that job. So all of these folks were good. All they needed was a light shined on them and a little direction, and they then took off and turned the battalion around. And before you know it, the spirit came, and one of the first things, I'd always come from airborne. So airborne, you salute airborne all the way above the rest, strike force, whatever kind of unit you're from. And so I thought, well, we needed that same thing here. So I said, now when you're saluting, you will salute and say, hardcore recondo. And I wanted to make them have that airborne spirit, and after a while they would think they were airborne soldiers. That's how it goes. And when they responded, if they saluted, the officer would respond, no fuzzing slack. And everybody says, oh, that's Mickey Mouse. And they had a big joke about G.I. Joe Lifer. That's what they call me. And suddenly there was a slow conversion, and suddenly they stood a little taller, and they walked a little prouder, and they were proud they belonged to the hardcore battalion. And remember all that graffiti on their helmets? those green helmets. On the other side of that helmet was the desert color, the brown that you see the boys wearing now as they get ready to go to Kuwait. So I said, well, we couldn't get new helmet liners, covers, so I said, turn them around. But they said, look, we're in the green jungle. I said, I don't give a rat's ass. Turn the things around. So the incredible effect that this had was the Viet Cong, after a while, said, stay away from those brown-hatted guys. They're really mean. And so the battalion slowly turned around. And my next problem was to realize that they didn't have the kind of skill level that my previous battalion in the 101 had. It had been together for 10 years. I had been in the unit, the 101st Airborne, for 4 years. The battalion had been the 3rd Battalion of the 187 of the 11th Airborne, and later it was converted to the 1st Battle Group 327-101. Then later it was, Army loves to reorganize. Then it was converted to the 1st Battalion, 327 Airborne Infantry. But many of those NCOs, remember I said NCOs are the steel spine of any unit? They had been in that same battalion for all of those years. So they knew that battalion. In one company, every soldier in the company had the name of their company, which was ABU, tattooed on the left ankle. And you couldn't get in the company unless you went down and got that tattoo. So you can imagine the pride they had. They were together so long that they knew their equipment so well that these old sergeants could identify a water can that had a dent in it 10 years before from a parachute drop, say in Japan. That's my water can. Water cans are not serial numbered item. That's how well they knew their stuff. So you can imagine the cohesion. You can imagine the spirit, the camaraderie, the teamwork that battalion had. It could do anything. It could attack and withdraw, do night operations, you name it, it could do it. And to give you an illustration of its great depth, in one fight, which was in March of 1966, in Tuiwa, anybody had the pleasure of visiting Tuiwa? There we go, quite a few folks here. In Tuiwa, we were in a terrible fight. And my A company had lost all of its officers. They were all down, either dead or wounded. All the platoon sergeants were down. First sergeant was down. So there was no leadership left in the company. They were about 300 meters from where I was with B Company, and we were not going to get linked up with them before dark. They had a lot of dead and a lot of wounded. We needed to get a perimeter, quick, smart. I needed to reconstitute the chain of command, but I couldn't get anybody. I couldn't get another senior sergeant or a captain in there, the S4 and all that good stuff. No way I could get him in there. So I got on the internal freak of A Company and said, this is Steel 6, which is my call sign, and listen up, any leader here? And one of the old boys says, well, Major Hackworth, this is Simpson down here in the 3rd Squad, 3rd Platoon, Sergeant Simpson. I said, Sergeant Simpson, you think you could take that lash off, put him in a perimeter, get him tight for the night, medevac your wounded out of there, take care of your dead, and square him away until dawn when we can link up with you? Roger that, sir. Been preparing for this job for 10 years. That was the kind of depth that we had in that unit, where a squad leader could become company commander. Now, go back to the draftee battalion, the battalion that we're telling you about here. For example, in only one company, B Company, I'll give you a classic example of the depth of experience we had. Company commander was 16 months out of West Point. He was the most experienced guy in the unit. His senior sergeant was 14 months in the Army, full stop. All of the leadership was shake and bake. Now, shake and bake, everybody know what that is, or should I explain it? That is, very bright people were picked up in AIT and said, you're a lieutenant, you're a sergeant, you're a lieutenant, you're a sergeant. Then the sergeants went to a reduced OCS, Officer Candidate Course, which was 11 weeks. And the lieutenant went to, I think, 16 weeks. And then the butter bar became the most dangerous thing in the world, a second lieutenant. And the sergeant became a squad leader and or a platoon sergeant. If he was the honor graduate, he made E6 or E7, platoon sergeant. Now, in my Army, you didn't get a squad. You were even in consideration for a squad 8 to 10 years, platoon 15 to 20 years. So now you got these young, inexperienced kids running this unit, the shake and bake. So there was no depth of experience. So when I analyzed this and said, "Now, God, we're Sloot and squared away. We're morale is coming up. These guys are no longer think I'm Attila the Hun." And I was there I brought my first sergeant major in with me, who had been with me in Korea in the same unit. He'd also been with me at Fort Campbell together, and also a first sergeant in my 1327 battalion on the first tour. So we were tight, and he became sergeant major, and I said, "Bob, you go to the left, I'll go to the right, just kick ass, take names, get things squared away." And that's how we did things. And we started slowly turning the battalion around. But I realized that because of the level of experience, we would never be able to ever achieve what we had in the 101, because we just couldn't do all the tricks that were necessary to do. So then I came upon the idea of specialization. And I was going to treat the battalion kind of like you treat a dumb dog. And I gave each company a particular mission. And that's all they would do. One trick, dumb dog, jump over the ball, roll on your back and go, whatever it happened to be. And so the first way of doing this was A company became long-range ambush. We were in water. You have to understand what the terrain was like. We were in water up to our waist and mud up to our waist all of the time. You could never leave a company out more than 4 days without immersion foot occurring. An immersion foot would put a hole in your foot or leg about like a bullet had gone through it, and it would knock out a company in a minute. So you could stay no longer than 4 days. So Alert Company was split in half into 2 big, strong platoons, and they operated outside the fan. The fan is 11.2, 105 in those days, 105, and that's exactly 11.2. There's the gun there, you reach out there, and that comes out 11.2. I mean, God gave me that, so I could go and figure out what the fan was. And so I always put A company outside the fan, because I wanted Charles to tap A company, thinking it was a little 8-man ambush, and he'd find 60 really tough hombres, and I could have helicopters on them, gunships, within about 7 to 10 minutes. So they were bait, and they knew they were bait. And then B company was a ranger company. They slipped into the darkness and operated as a ranger unit, stealth, surprise, ambushing the enemy, out-guerrillaing the enemy, and so on. C company was short-range ambush. 8, 7-men ambush patrols, slip out every night, and they also split in 2. So half were drying out back at their fire bases and training, and the other half were out doing their ambush thing, because they could only do it for 4 days. And then Delta Company was air mobile and ambush. And the recon platoon was deactivated, and they became the sniper platoon. Every man in that platoon was a volunteer, was an expert marksman, had the combat infantry badge, and was very squared away as a warrior. There were 20 men in the sniper platoon. They killed 458 enemy soldiers and didn't have one friendly KIA, which is put the hurt on Charles in a big way. And so all of these specializations work together, and they do it day in and day out, and they became expert on ranger or air mobile or ambushing. And then when intelligence, or when we figured that Charles was the enemy, was in a particular place, we would end up, I wouldn't act like the average American unit that saw the enemy and went and jumped on him. I just let him, it ignored the enemy and let him cook and let him stew until I went after him when I wanted to go after him, on the ground that I wanted to go after him, at the time I wanted to go after him. So once I'd isolated a target, then I would bring in the alert company that was way far out. They'd sneak up and go to a choke point. It might take them 4 days, but they would be at the back door of that enemy. And Claymore Company would slip in and go to other choke points. And then Delta Company would sneak in, that was a Ranger Company, and go to other choke points. And the snipers would be employed night and day. They flew night in helicopters with starlight scopes, and in the daytime they set up in various spots, 2-man snipers talk about, what do you call it in Spanish? Conads or something, big conads. You had to be a very, very brave hombre to be doing that kind of stuff. And then on the morning of an attack, wham! The Air Mobile Company, Battle Company, B Company, would land right smack on top of the enemy. Now what'd the enemy do? Did they fight? Or did they run? They ran. Where'd they run to? All the doors that we sealed up. And our guys went toot, 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 and victory after victory started coming to these boys the way. And these were lopsided victories. For example, the last victory on May the 22nd, 1969, that I tell about in the book, it relates to a similar story. We did it just as I described to you. We ended up with 3 Americans slightly wounded, and Jerry Sullivan, a boy from Claymore Company that got a bad mine, but quite seriously wounded. That was it, 4 wounded, and we killed over 200 enemy. It was a force far larger than ours. It was a reinforced battalion. We were a light, skinny, light battalion, and we ended up destroying that reinforced battalion and kind of winding them up, taking their colors and their logbook and all of that good stuff. And so it shows you what kids with proper leadership can do. Now, the troops really weren't saying, oh, Hack, we love you when I first came there, because at that time in Vietnam, there was a thing called fragging. And if any leader was strong and hard and bad, from a squad leader, platoon sergeant, company commander, battalion commander, he might wake up one night in his hole with something rolling around, and it was a hand grenade, which comes the term fragging, fragmentation hand grenade. And we were averaging about 1,000 American KIA a year from fragging at that time. So the first sergeant major came to me and said, boss, there's a little problem here. I said, what's that, Sergeant Major? And he said, boys in B Company put a little price on your head. And I said, well, how much is it? He says, $3,500. I said, forget it. That's nothing. So we just kept going. And a few weeks later, he says, boss, it's $10,000 now. I said, we got to do something about this. This is serious. But eventually, the troops realized that what I was about and what the leadership of the battalion was about was keeping them alive. Don't sit there and get hammered as they had been. Don't sit there and react to the enemy, but go in there and take the war to the enemy. Make him run. What did George Patton say about, where is my friend Wes? What did he say about don't kill those bastards? Or
no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country?
Yeah, no bastard ever won a war by dying for their country. And it was, I had to develop in them a principle of war, the offense, take the war to the enemy. Once they realized that they could take the war to the enemy and they weren't getting blasted apart by those horrendous mines, the 3 things of war, the 3 considerations of war are weather, the terrain, and the enemy. And in the Mekong Delta, of all the battlefields I have visited as a soldier or as a war correspondent, which is a little bit more than a dozen, I ain't seen no place worse than the Mekong Delta because of the weather, because of the terrain, and because of the enemy. The weather, if it wasn't raining, it was raining. And you know about the mud and the wet, and you're always wet and you're always muddy. You never dried out. And if you found a dry patch anywhere in the Delta, the ants owned it. And those ants were VC ants, and they'd fight you for that piece of ground. And I have Guys in the battalion have told me stories of soldiers in that battalion in a firefight with bullets snapping over their head, get bit by ants and stand up. It was so bad, and swat those ants out. So, and then the third element was you had the enemy. And the enemy wasn't some the enemy weren't amateurs. These guys were hardcore pros. Their great granddaddies started it all. And they beat the French. They beat the Japanese. They beat the French again. They beat the Saigon government. And now they called us long noses. You know why? Now they were having their little go at the long noses. And they were doing a pretty good job on us. So you were looking at fourth and fifth generation warriors. It was embedded in them. They were totally dedicated to the cause. Hey, they wore a little red star up here. They carried Soviet gear. They didn't know communism from ice creamism. What they were about was independence. They wanted to get rid of us. So they were fighting with that same kind of gusto that our patriot ancestors fought with in 1776 against the British. And what they did was they were not going to give us an inch in order to, and they knew the battlefield. They knew how to, most American units fought. So what we had to do, their advantage was very much like if you were sitting in a darkened audience and I'm on a stage and it's all lit up, you're the guerrilla, and every advantage is yours. Because I'm on the stage, and you can sit there and say, well, the guard is asleep there. That machine gun doesn't look like it works there. There's a good avenue of approach here, and this guy is a real sleeper. We can get in there in a minute. And they can eyeball and check out every one of your strengths and your vulnerabilities. They know your weaknesses, and they know where to hit you. So the key thing there was to shut the lights off on the stage. And so the first step was to flip the lights off. Then the next step was to steal a page from the Viet Cong and use their very tactics against them. And that's precisely what we did. We took the war to them, and in the end, the battalion achieved this incredible record of killing almost, and I know it's certainly the ladies here would think that soldiers are butchers and all of that stuff, but that was what we did. That was our business. And the battalion killed 2,600 enemy soldiers at the price of 25 of American soldiers. The ratio was 1 to 100. If every battalion in the United States Army had copied our tactics with their equally dumb soldiers, their equally badly trained soldiers, equally badly led soldiers, but just replicated what we did, all 100 battalions, Ho Chi Minh could have not handled the pain. He would have got on his hat and zipped on his bicycle all the way back to Hanoi and said, I ain't going there till those Americans get out of there. And we could have won the war tactically. We could have never won the war strategically because of the Saigon government. They were bums, as simple as that. They were mostly Catholics controlling a Buddhist country. You do the math. And they all had bank accounts in Paris. So what the Army did after this great achievement on the part of this all-draftee unit was they decided to what they called Vietnamization, and that meant start bringing American units home and announce that we had won the war and the Vietnamese could handle it because we'd build them up into this big Jack Dempsey, and they were lean and mean and could carry on the war and finally defeat the opponent. And they took the battalion. It was the first battalion in the U.S. Army in Vietnam, infantry battalion, to return to the United States. And they sent them to Hawaii. They gave them all a lei. Now, lei is a flower. You know, the Army was just not that broad-minded. And they then patted them on the head and scratched their belly and disbanded them. And all of the lessons that they learned were lost, totally lost. And then the Army, in its humiliation, over the execution of the war in Vietnam, because they were fighting World War II. They didn't want to know about how to really fight the war. They thought they could use this huge sledgehammer and just beat their opponent to death, as they did the Nazis and the Germans and anybody else that ever got in our way. And so they were so humiliated because of the Vietnam experience that they wanted to forget it, and they took all those lessons that were learned by the Hardcore Battalion and a lot of other units there, and put them under a rug and got some super glue and sealed that sucker to the ground, and they were lost forever. So what we have here is a story of one battalion, which is an emblem of every unit that fought in Vietnam, that fought the war correctly, and their lessons are so incredible for this long war that we're now engaged in, because we need to dust off those lessons, and so they're so applicable in this war that's going to rage for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And those heroes that fought in Vietnam, many of them came home and were treated as I explained to you, and feel very much that their service was in vain, without realizing that that's not the case. That the case, in fact, is that their lessons that they learned will be passed on to their children today. If you stop and think about it, their kids are just about old enough to be our soldiers in Afghanistan, the Philippines, Somalia, Saddam, and Iraq in the months to come, that will be carrying the war of the future. So their lessons learned will keep their kids alive and their grandkids alive in the war of the futures, in this terrible, terrible war of terrorism. So the end result of the book, which I hope it turns on the nation and causes the nation to realize what noble heroes our Vietnam veterans are, and do this for all of us so we can all have healing, is to welcome them home. And also to understand that their lessons are absolutely priceless, and they'll keep us, bring us into the winning circle in this war on terrorism. So I thank you for listening to this long harangue, and I'm happy to answer questions on Vietnam, on the book, or on the war that we're now involved in. Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you. And I promise you, this is my first drink today.
Where is that colonel that you just succeeded? Is he in training in the Pentagon now?
The colonel
That preceded you?
that I replaced. He went to the Pentagon. He was the Army Chief of Staff's aide-de-camp, and he made full colonel, and then he retired. And I'm sure that he's hanging his head in shame for his conduct. And in a way, and I've thought about it, and I didn't use his name because I didn't want to humiliate him, because he was a victim of the system. And the system was, what we should have had in Vietnam was professional soldiers go over with their battalions and stay with their battalions until a certain time, then bring their battalions back, let those who wanted to get out, keep the battalion together, the NCOs and the officers, and put in new people and train them and let them go home. This lieutenant colonel was in our 4th year of war out in Vietnam scratching for his CIB. He had never been in combat, never been in Vietnam before. He was not qualified to command a battalion, as were so many of the commanders in Vietnam. And we can never allow that to happen again. Yes, sir, right behind you.
Do you think there was any danger that China or Russia could have gotten involved and it could have escalated into a larger thing in Vietnam?
The question is, was there a threat of Russia or China jumping into the war? Both had jumped into the war. They were materially supporting. They were providing fighter pilots, advisors throughout Vietnam, Chinese and Russian advisors, providing all kinds of high-tech intercept equipment and technology. So they were very much deep in the war, because what the war was about at the higher level, it was really the Cold War being fought in somebody else's backyard. And so the Soviets wanted to bleed us, just like we a few years later bled them in Afghanistan when we supported their opponents. That was a great consideration. You remember, Korea was still in everybody's mind. The Chinese jumped in the war in November of 1950 and really cleaned our clock, gave our army its most decisive victory in its history, driving them back from the Yalu River, almost 300 clicks, to beyond south of Seoul. So everybody was very antsy about that possibility. Not being a strategist, I couldn't go much further than that, but it was certainly a consideration of why we were so timid early in the war about knocking off the bridges between North Vietnam and China to cut out the supplies, the railroad capability of bringing in stuff, and knocking out the bases in their sanctuaries in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, which was a major mistake of the war. Yes, sir.
Maybe you can answer this confused question that I've read about since Vietnam. They said that initially the average grunt didn't fire his weapon in Vietnam, and then I think you did a study after that and said, yes, he did, he just didn't hit anything. Which is true?
There was a study in World War II conducted by Slam Marshall. It was kind of a fantasy study, but it got him a very prominent place in the military's mind. And the generals didn't know, so they believed Slam, and Slam made it all up. And you got the honor him right here in this town. But his most famous book is a hoax, which said infantry didn't fire their rifles in World War II. My question is, where did all those dead Germans come from? And that wasn't true. But ironically, his influence on the generals changed infantry training and put a lot more emphasis on marksmanship and live fire exercise and all of those things. So it really worked to our benefit. My experience in a couple tours in Vietnam was I never saw an American soldier ever have any problem of zinging off a few rounds. If anything, hey man, you're going too much, you're shooting too much. So I don't think that was a problem. Right, Jerry?
That's right.
And my good buddy there. And a great battalion commander during this time. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, sir, do you think that we ought to go after Saddam Hussein now and finish the job that Bush should have done when he was there?
But one question at a time. I'm almost 72. We'll get the second one here. And the question is, should we go after Saddam Hussein? And my view is absolutely yes, for many, many reasons, and not just to cite that he'd broken every promise and every treaty that he signed with Storm and Norman on 28 February 1991. Two, he has weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological, that we know of. It doesn't have a few. He has tons and tons and tons of this stuff. And he's used it against his own people, so he's shown that he would use this stuff. He is not too far, according to intelligence, to being able to have a nuke weapon that he can strap on those missiles he's got, which would change the whole dimension of power in that region and cause a whole bunch of people to hurt. Meaning his missiles scuds have been greatly improved by North Korea and by the graciousness of Bill Clinton providing China with a lot of technology that got into North Korea, that got into Iraq. And I reckon that he's got to go, and I think he will go, and it'll be much like what we had in '64 when Goldwater said, we're going there, and LBJ said, no, we're not, but then we had the election and off we went. So maybe after November would be the time to go, one, and two, it's perfect time in weather because it's cool out in the desert, and our boys are going to have to be really covered up in their little tents because Saddam Hussein is going to know that he's going to go down. And so as a result, he will surely use weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological, as Adolf Hitler would have in May the 8th, 45, when he was going down. So we've got to protect our soldiers, and I think they're damn well, from what I can find out, the new equipment and new protection and detection stuff is dynamite, and we'll be able to get through that. So will it be fast? I think that it'll be very much like Desert Storm 1, with a much smaller force. Our weapons are smarter. Our tanks are far more capable when they were then, and they were dynamite then. But the new model is far superior to the ones we had in Desert Storm. You saw in Afghanistan what air power can do now with all that smart stuff. I mean, that was our smart stuff back in Desert Storm. Couldn't even get in the first grade, and compared to what we have today. So I think that it would be a quick victory, and it'll send a whole big signal to the rest of the terrorist states that are supporting these little bastards that are attacking us, who are trying to destroy our way of life. What they're about is the destruction of Christianity, destruction of Judaism, and they want to take our civilization and whack it back to the 10th century, so we'll be tied in with them, and that ain't going to happen. Okay, yes, sir.
Just a vague question, sir. Why don't you write or expose or somehow sort of write something that identifies and tells us about the military-industrial congressional complex that started this war? I mean, weren't the grunts and the noms sacrificed for the almighty dollar?
Well, I think that your question, Dwight David Eisenhower said to the nation in 1960, and he coined the expression, the Military-Industrial Congressional Complex, the MIC, and it certainly exists. But the MIC is not something that we discovered. It's not something new. It's been going along since man used the jawbone as an ass as a military weapon. And it's up to we citizens to turn that around. I was very moved recently when the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who I consider a very outstanding American, a real patriot, a guy that really knows what's going on, killed the Crusader artillery piece, $13 billion Cold War weapon. We don't need it. And I'm an infantryman, and I belong to the queen of battle. But I'll tell you what, I have great respect for artillery, who are the king of battle. But it was a wise decision on the part of the President and the Secretary of Defense, which was a MIC weapon, by the way. And guess whose daddy was sitting on the board of the company that made the Crusader? George Bush's father. And our president had the guts to say, kill it. Imagine the phone call he got that night. Yes, sir. Is this the last question?
You've got time. 6 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Well, I hate for it to be the last question. It's sort of philosophical.
Well, I'm not sure you're the last question. This is the referee here.
Okay. Well, do you not think that this country needs patriots like you and me that are willing to fight without questioning, but also the Jane Fondas that forces the government to justify our wars?
Well, I think the country has a great number of patriots, and they have certainly stood tall over the years since we became a republic, and I'm quite sure it will continue to. I see no genetic change to the American youth. They're just as good and tough as they've always been. All they need is the same thing as that hopeless battalion needed, was a little leadership. Yes, sir.
In light of all the information we're getting from the president about sending federal troops to our border, how do you feel about that?
I don't feel about that because my expertise is a very limited thing. Remember the dumb dog? I know about the military, and I try to understand that in every way, from the basic weapon to the tactic that's employed to the strategy. But I don't know about that, so I can't answer it because it's outside of my area of knowledge. I'd like to know about it. I think it has to be studied. Yes, sir.
Do you
Great.
think our military is doing a proper job of basic military training?
The question is, do I think that the military is doing a good job in training? Well, let's start with the training of non-commissioned officers. I don't think that we've ever had a better training system in the history of the United States Army for the education of our NCOs. I don't think we've ever had a finer NCO corps. And I think that the education of our young officers has been really fine-tuned, where it is also excellent, from the basic course, from ROTC, West Point, right up to Command and General Staff College. What bothers me is what I see going on at places of initial entry training, i.e. basic training. And if you look at my website, which is www.hackworth.com, you'll see a piece called The Porcelain Soldiers, which gives the story of my wife and I visiting Fort Jackson for 2 weeks and talking to all the trainees. And all the trainees would tell me, as I asked them, what do you think of the training here? It's fun. Man, it wasn't fun when I was there. And so if you have a look at my website and read that piece, we have really lost sight of what it takes to build a fire, to forge a sword in basic training, to instill the discipline, instill the basics that you need to survive on the battlefield. And that has been lost. It's been lost by the last decade of kinder, gentler consideration for others, BS. But I see that also turning around. I see that the new general who was running Fort Jackson is an airborne ranger that dropped in Grenada, dropped in Panama, tough and mean as a snake. And the guy that he replaced was this jerk that bragged to me when I interviewed him that he had the highest casualties during Desert Storm. And I said, yes, General, they were caused by friendly fire, your own fire. He turned red. Yes, sir.
In reference to the news coverage during the war in Vietnam, naturally it was pretty graphic and pretty well reported in the news media. What is your opinion on that? And
so,
do you feel?
Then we can come back to that second one. Well, the media coverage of the war in Vietnam was much different from Desert Storm, where the press corps was kind of locked in hotels and not allowed to go look at the battlefield. In Vietnam it was just kind of open. They could jump in a chopper, go out and report the war, and the American people had a very excellent idea of the war anyway, because the minute we started putting draftees in the war, then the truth started coming out. When my brigade from the 101, which was all regular, marched over in June of 1965, we were filling body bags. No one said a word, because those body bags were all regulars, and the regulars were from the other side, the railroad tracks, and their daddies wore blue shirts, and there was not a whole bunch of noise in the paper. It wasn't until the draft came and the banker's son and the doctor's son and the lawyer's son and all of that started filling body bags when the protests started beginning. So that gives you a suggestion that maybe it's best, if you have a serious war like that, to ensure that we have a cross-section of the population and that they all don't have an opportunity to go to Oxford. Yes, sir.
We're your friends and admirers, and we're here because we like the message that you put out on many occasions. What do you get back the other way from the establishment, from the Pentagon, from the leaders who don't seem to change generation to generation? Do they call you? Do they write you? Do you get angry messages?
Well,
what do you hear from them?
What I'm told at the top is that the senior leadership of the military go to work in the morning, and you go through the mall of the Pentagon, and there's bookstores and they sell newspapers there. And there's the Washington Post, which is the local newspaper, and they get the paper and they take it to their desk and they lay it on their desk. Then they don't look at the front page. They go to the obituary page to see if that old son of a bitch is dead yet. So it just hasn't changed, and I have really thought it out. And a friend of mine was General Reimer, who was the main man of the Army, and I've talked to him 10, 15 times a day, and I, by email mainly, provided him with commo. He invited me to speak to all of his generals, his commanding generals, and boy, that was kind of like Adolf Hitler at a rabbi convention. And and what I found among not all, but the senior brass of the United States military, specifically the Navy, the United States Air Force, and the United States Army, not the United States Marine Corps, is total denial. And it might be that they went to West Point for 4 years, they've served for 35, 36 years, they got 40 years service. That's their organization. They made that organization, and they can't accept what's going on. And their problem is, it was the problem of Vietnam, was simply this, that the top was not in touch with the bottom, meaning the big brass did not go down and talk to the grunt. If they did, if you'd have had Chesty Pullers, if you'd have had folks like George Patton, they would have gone, talked to the grunt would have said, this rifle doesn't work, this tactic sucks, and so on, and we would have been squared away. So they got to get out of their ivy towers and get down talking to the folks who are walking the walk and talking the talk. The guys that won the brilliant war in Afghanistan, and that's the Green Berets and folks like that. A lot of good folks out there. They're doing a hell of a job for all of us. Thank you very much.
David Hackworth currently writes a nationally syndicated column called Defending America. His books include About Face, Hazardous Duty, and Price of Honor. His latest, Steal My Soldiers' Hearts, is published by Rugged Land, online at ruggedland.com.
If you'd like a videotape copy of the programs you've been watching this weekend or any week,